Hello everyone and welcome to my channel and welcome to this video. Today we will be practicing some watercolor textures. If you're struggling with that, this is a definitely good video for you to give it a try and maybe in the process learn something, get to know your watercolors and also create a nice beautiful abstract art. I will be using this Gerstaecker watercolor paper. It is cold press watercolor paper. It is also 100% cellulose. I will be using brushes from Raphael. This is flat number 22 and round soft aqua number 0. Also, I will be using these watercolors from Whiteness, just a couple of colors. I will be letting you know which colors I'm using at the time. Also, I will be using ink pen. This is just from Stabilo, an ink pen, fountain pen. You can use any ink pen you like. So I will be doing 4 different, shapes, abstracts, and I guess, as I said, this will be a nice practice to textures. And first, I'm just picking up a little bit of indanthrene blue and turquoise from my palette, and also just a tiny bit of raw sienna, just to mix in a nice blue color that is going to be slightly, toned down. And I'm going to start with the first circle. Also, this video is going to be almost in real time. I've just slightly sped it up so you can paint with me. And I did my first circle. You can see I'm using this brush that is a quite thirsty brush. It can hold quite amount of the water. So I have painted in my first circle, picking up a little bit of the turquoise, and again using quite amount of the water. And I'm gonna paint in the second shape, just touching the first one. And since the consistency of color, pigment and water is pretty similar, and also colors are pretty similar, it's not so visible how they're bleeding into each other and mixing. As I said, it's a quite similar consistency. So if I was using a lot more pigment that I'm just doing right now, you can see how slightly it bleeds into the blue. Also, gonna pick up a little bit of the paint. As I said, we're gonna be creating textures. So adding water, picking up water, mixing 2 colors one into each other. We're gonna do this wet in wet. So we're painting all of the shapes wet into the other wet shapes. So you can see again quite similar consistency, and that didn't bleed so much. So now I have picked up a lot more of the pigment, and it's just going into my blues. And nothing is too wet. I don't have any puddles on my shapes. Just want to add a little bit more of the pigment where I want a little bit more of the bleed. And now I've just picked up clean water with my brush and just tapping in with the tip of the brush and creating again a little bit more of the texture. And also, while the paint is still wet, paper is still wet, I'm picking up a little bit more of the pigment first mix and just adding it on the corners just to create a little bit nicer texture. And you can play around just as you like, adding drops of water, adding drops of pigment into your shapes. That is completely up to you. I decided to leave those first 3 clean, and I'm not going to add colors into each other. I will be doing that later on. So I'm going to dry this now. And also with those hair dryers, you can also create shapes, because if you have your puddles in some parts of your shapes and you dry the area that it's drier first and then those puddles at the end, you will get a nice textures from that water that was sitting there. So that's also a nice tip, just creating textures with your hair dryer. Unfortunately, while I was drying my shapes, my camera stopped, so I have just added a couple of dots with the ink pen and also made a couple of larger ones and a couple of smaller ones. And as I said, we painted first one wet on wet. Then moving on to the second one, it's going to be wet on dry this time. And I will be using a little bit of quinacridone rose. Just putting that on my palette and then again starting with my first shape. You can see I'm using quite an amount of the pigment and not again too much water in my brush. It is nice, I guess, a little bit milky consistency. It's not very watery. Again, just picking up a clean water and moving the paint around with my brush, tapping in a little bit at the corners just to add some textures. And as I said, remember, when you're adding a little bit more of the pigment and water in some parts of your shapes, that's going to dry slower and it's going to create those nicer edges. So as I said, I first dried the part where the less water was, and now I'm just drying the part where there is more water. And you can see that texture now that it's dry. It's also nice to have that in mind later on when you do your painting. So this is, as I said, just a practice and will help you understand a little bit more about the watercolors and also create a nice art in between. So I have mixed a little bit of the quinacridone rose, a little bit of the rose sienna, and some tiny bit of the, I guess, indanthrene blue that was there to create this saturated and toned down pink color. You can see it's quite transparent. This time I'm using a lot of water in my brush. And also I'm not expecting bleeds this time because I'm painting wet on dry. So my first shape is dry and my second is wet. So you can see there is a clean and sharp edge there. And I do want to have the same nice texture on this one also. So I'm just tapping in, creating some puddles of paint and water nearest to the edge. Of course, the shape is still wet, so when adding those dots, it will bleed. And you can see right now adding just the dots or little drops of water to create a different kind of texture. I'm gonna again dry that. And now that it's dried, you can see how beautiful textures we got. So for my third shape, I'm picking up a little bit of rose sienna and tiny bit of burnt sienna. Again, mixing quite watered down consistency. You can see I'm adding lots of water to my pigments because I do want this one also to be quite transparent. At least the first layer of it. So just painted in the first shape. I'm gonna dry it. And now that it's dry, I'm just gonna add a little bit less watered down consistency, a little bit more of the pigment in my paints. I did want to have this one transparent layer underneath without the bleeds, so I have painted lighter on the bottom and darker on the top. Added a few drops of water, and again I'm gonna dry it. So again, now that it's dried, I'm gonna add some doodles on top, and I'm gonna use ink pen. So this is not really a waterproof ink pen, so I can't paint on top of it, but if you have a waterproof, or I guess ink pen that does not dissolve in water ink, you can use it and then add some details on top if that's what you like. At the end, I'm gonna finish all of my watercolor layers and then doodle on top. So just adding some small little lines, shapes again here. And this is time to be creative and to just let loose. So if you would like, you can just do whatever doodles you like. So now that we're done with the second one, we're gonna move on to the third one. Again, for this one, I'm using some raw sienna and burnt umber mix. Painted in first a very, very light layer, a bit more water in my consistency, and then just tapping in a little bit more saturated paint on the corners, parts where I do want to have some textures and shapes. Also picking up a little bit of the paint with my brush, again creating those textures. I'm gonna dry that, and when it dried, I'm moving on to the second shape, and I've added to the mix of my colors of raw sienna and burnt sienna some burnt umber to make it slightly darker. But it is still, as you can see, a watered down consistency. So just gonna paint in first that shape, add in few drops of color mix for the texture. And now I will mix in some indanthrene blue with that mix of browns, and I'm gonna go straight on top of it. This layer we're gonna paint wet on wet. So I'm gonna paint in my shape, and you can see how the paint bleeds, but not too much, again, because I do have quite similar consistency of paint and water, and they're just mixing in nicely. I'm also going outside of that shape, and you can see how the edges of both shapes are quite crisp and sharp, and just the part where they mix is very nice and soft. It almost looks like those two shapes are merged one into the other. So I'm gonna add a few drops again of water for the texture. You can absolutely use also salt here if you want to create textures with salt. I wasn't patient enough to wait for salt to work and to dry, so I wanted to be a little bit faster. I'm gonna dry that now. And again, after it dried, I'm gonna do my doodles. This time I'm just gonna do some curvy lines. And I do want them to start in one horizontal line and to finish in one same vertical line. So just doing those curves, minding that. And you can see also just correcting where that wasn't the case, where I was just going a little bit in on out or out. So like that. Also, I will do a couple of more doodles. Here, I think it's missing something, so I decided to add a few doodles there. Again, this is completely up to you. This is just a practice and fun painting doodle session, so we can do whatever we want. And this is also a nice idea for cards. You can just use this idea and do whatever shape you like for your cards. And for the last one, I'll be using this larger flat brush. So just picking up a lot of water and adding it to my mix of blues and browns and just paint it in one line. First shape, and then picking up some more indanthrene blue and mixing it with browns. I'm gonna add it straight on top of my other shape. This is actually a little bit more of turquoise blue. Just going on top of the first shape with the second one, and it's of course gonna go one into each other, bleed one into each other. Some quite saturated indanthrene blue, and you can see straight away when I'm adding a lot more pigment and less water, it just bleeds a lot better, because when you're adding water to water, it would just sit on one spot, and when you're adding a lot of the pigment to the water consistency, it's gonna bleed. This is just some burnt umber, burnt sienna in my blues, and on top I'm gonna paint in the second shape. It's gonna be from quinacridone rose mixed in with blues that are already on my palette. And again, I'm gonna go on top of the second shape, and it's gonna bleed again one into the other. Some drops of water. And then I'm gonna pick up a little bit of the browns mixed in with the blues and paint in the next shape. This time you can see very watered down consistency. And since I'm touching the stone from underneath, it's gonna bleed into, or stone, yeah, that's good. That could be a stack of stones. It's gonna bleed into this one. Watercolors are super fun, and when you leave them do their thing, they can be truly amazing. So I do encourage you to do more shapes and to do more practices. Actually, these 4 are also going to be available in real time on my Patreon. As I said, I did slightly sped this up, so it's just like, I don't know, 15-20% sped up. It's going to be slower on my Patreon. Also, I'm going to do, I think, 7 or 8 additional ones. So if you like these, you can find additional ones on my, as I said, Patreon, along with many more tutorials there, and will paint with me these in real time. So just gonna add a couple of drops of water here and there. And with that, you also need to be careful, because if the paper is already too wet, that water won't create the shapes you might want. So it has to be wet, damped, but not wet with puddles and water sitting on top. So just also try to practice these water drops. So adding a little bit more of the paint underneath my... First, this actually dried already, those first two shapes, and I'm painting that wet on dry with some browns, adding drops of water for the texture. And I will dry that now. And after it dried, I'm just gonna finish it off again with a few more doodles. So guys, I hope you did enjoy this video and paint with me. Maybe, as I said, you made it into cards. That's also fine. With nice text just beneath it, it would be, or next to it, it will be very, very nice. And I do love, well, practicing that way. Why would even practice be boring, right? We can create art while we practice also. So if you did like this video, please hit the like button, share it, comment. If you haven't still, please do subscribe to my channel. I have many tutorials here. I'm sure you will find something for yourself. And also check out my Patreon. You can find there a lot more of these and also many more real-time tutorials, step-by-step tutorial that I'm sure you're gonna love. There is a link in the description box. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope I will also see you next time. Bye!